There is a river in North Florida where divers work in total darkness, and where the oldest argument in American archaeology lies in the mud. The water is stained black by cypress swamp. Alligators live in it. A diver down there often cannot see his own hands at all. Below the current, the riverbed drops away into a limestone sinkhole, and inside that sinkhole, deep in the mud, lay a mastodon tusk. Someone had cut it free. The layer around it dates to 14,550 years ago, 13 centuries before Clovis, the culture long taught as America's first. So who was standing over this animal, 13 centuries too early, on a continent where no human being was supposed to be at all? And how did they ever reach Florida in the first place, when the only road into the continent was still sealed shut by ice? That question has three hard edges, and this river hands them over one at a time, in the order the divers found them. 71 separate dates. And an argument that is still not finished. The place is called Page Ladson in Jefferson County, Florida, and the whole excavation was carried out on the bed of the Osceola River. The Osceola is a short, dark river that cuts down through the porous limestone of the Florida Panhandle and empties into the Gulf. In places it disappears underground entirely, drops away through the porous stone, and surfaces again far downstream as though nothing at all had happened. That is simply what limestone country does. Water dissolves the rock from below, and the ground above eventually collapses inward into a bowl. Thousands of years ago, when Florida was far drier than it is today, those bowls held some of the only fresh water around. Sea level was much lower then, and the peninsula stood far wider than it does now, dry grassland reaching west into the Gulf. Water was scarce on that plain. So a sinkhole with a pond in it became the one place where everything had to come. Mastodons came down to drink there. So did every other animal on that dry landscape, and, it now appears, so did people as well. Then the ice sheets melted, the sea came back, and the rising water swallowed the grassland and drowned the sinkholes under a river. Which is exactly why this site sits underwater at all, and why it took so very long for anyone to find the thing. But drowning is exactly what saved it. A sealed underwater sinkhole is one of the finest archives that this continent has ever offered. Nobody plowed it. No burrowing animal ever churned it. No tree root drove down through the layers and mixed the centuries all together. Under still cold water there is very little oxygen, so wood, bone, and ivory survive down here instead of rotting away to nothing. The result is a stack of layers lying in perfect order, oldest at the bottom, each one sealed by the layer above it. And that order is the entire point. In a sealed stack, a stone tool cannot simply sink down into a much older year. It is the difference between a claim and a case. And this river, unlike almost anywhere else on the continent, could make the case. Working it, though, is another matter entirely. Divers descend into water the color of strong coffee and take the daylight down with them. Lamps do almost nothing. The tannin in the water eats the light, and the beam dies about an arm's length from the glass. So they map the trench by feel alone, hand over hand along a grid of lines strung between stakes driven into the mud. Everything is done blind and slow. Sediment is fanned away by hand and lifted up to the surface in buckets to be screened. Picture the moment, a hand moving through black water, meeting something smooth and cold and enormously old, and then simply stopping dead there. That is how this place gives things up. Not with a flash of gold, but with an unfamiliar shape under the searching fingers. The first serious excavation here ran from 1983 to 1997. Season after season, under the banner of the Osceola River Prehistory Project. It was led by David Webb and James Dunbar, and it was slow, expensive, unglamorous work, carried out one blind handful at a time. They brought up mastodon bone, ivory, and the cut-marked tusk out of a layer sitting well below everything Clovis had ever left behind. And when they published what those dates implied, most of the discipline politely declined to believe a single word of any of it, because the claim was not a small one. It said the textbook was wrong, and the textbook had held for most of a century. So the site sat there, mostly ignored, holding an answer that nobody had asked for the better part of 2 entire decades. The question did not go away. It simply went underwater with everything else and waited there for somebody willing to test it properly. And that is precisely what happened years later when a new team came back to the oscilla with a very much colder eye. They did not come to confirm the site. They came to break it, at the exact place where early American claims always break. Because a date is where these arguments live and die, and a date is the easiest thing in the world to get wrong. So the target was the date itself, and everything this site had ever claimed now rested on whether that date could survive the attack. Which is where the number 71 comes in, and where this story stops being a rumor out of a dark and difficult river. Radiocarbon dating works on one very simple fact. Everything alive takes in carbon, and a small, unstable share of it decays at a steady rate. When a living thing dies, the intake stops, and that unstable carbon runs down like a clock that nobody is winding anymore. Measure what is left of it, and the number hands back the exact moment when that plant or that animal stopped being alive. The weakness is obvious. One date is only ever one date, and a single date can go wrong in a dozen quiet ways. So the team took 71 radiocarbon dates, run on wood taken from the layers of that sinkhole, above the find, below the find, and directly beside it. And that is the moment this Black River stops being a rumor and becomes evidence the rest of the field has to answer. Because 71 dates do not scatter politely. They either agree with one another, or they take the whole claim down with them. They agreed. Bottom to top. In order, the dates stacked up exactly the way the layers themselves were stacked in the ground below. And they converged on 14,550 years before the present, for the one layer holding that cut-marked tusk itself. The site held, which is the part that changed things. Not the tusk, and not the marks, but a number that would not fall over when pushed. The result was published in a major journal in 2016 by Jesse Halligan, Michael Waters, and a long list of their colleagues. And this time, unlike the last time, the discipline actually sat down, read the thing carefully, and argued about it properly in print. The dates were only half the case. The other half was the mud itself and the order in which it had been laid down. In an undisturbed sinkhole, sediment settles year on year, and each layer seals the one beneath it like a lid on a jar. If the layers are intact, an object cannot travel down through them, and a young tool cannot end up in an old year. The team mapped those layers, tested them, and found no channel, no burrow, and no collapse that could have carried anything at all downward. Nothing had fallen through. Which brings this story back to the animal, and to the marks along its tusk, lying in a layer that will not move. It is worth being exact here, because this is the precise point where almost every popular retelling of Paige Ladson quietly goes badly wrong. 14,550 years is genuinely astonishing. It is not, however, the oldest known human evidence anywhere in the Americas. That title belongs elsewhere. Out on the white gypsum flats of New Mexico, at White Sands, human footprints have been dated to roughly 21 to 23,000 years. Those tracks are thousands of years older than this Florida tusk, and they belong to a different argument with a different set of problems. Paige Ladson is not the earliest site in America. It is something quieter, and for archaeology, a very great deal more useful than that. It is the best dated. one of the most securely dated pre-Clovis sites anywhere on the continent, with 71 dates and a sealed stack of layers behind it. An old age is easy enough to claim. An old age that survives 71 independent tests is an entirely different kind of statement. This channel has stood out on that white gypsum before, and it said the same careful thing there that it is saying here. A spectacular date is not a trophy. It is a bill, and sooner or later, somebody has to pay that bill in evidence. Page Ladson paid it, in wood samples and sealed layers and a single number that 71 separate measurements all managed to agree upon exactly. Far to the south, there is a second site that matters a great deal here in the cold and dripping forests of southern Chile. Monte Verde has a securely dated occupation at about 14,500 years, effectively the very same age as this Florida sinkhole. Two sites, two hemispheres, the very same century. And Chile is an extraordinarily long walk from any ice-free door in the far north. Monte Verde also carries older traces, running back toward 18,500 years, but its own authors call those far more tentative. They said so themselves in print about their own site, which is not remotely how a hoax or a hype campaign ever behaves. Which is what honest archaeology sounds like when it is working properly, and it is worth noticing how rarely that ever gets quoted. So the date holds, in Florida and in Chile, and the question from the very first minute has only grown heavier ever since. People were here. The road they are supposed to have used was not open yet. Something in that sentence has to give way. Something has to give. That is the last thing this story will hand over, because it is the one part that genuinely moves the whole argument forward. First, though, there is the animal itself, and there are the marks along its ivory that started every last bit of all this. Because there is a problem with the word butchered, and the people who actually found the tusk are the ones who raised it. Not the critics, and not the skeptics. The people who found it are the ones who put that caution down into writing themselves. And what they actually wrote is more interesting, and a very great deal more honest than any headline this find has received. The tusk came out of the sinkhole in pieces, ivory that had lain under that mud since the end of the last ice age. Along its surface run a series of marks. They are not gnaw marks. They are not the scrape of gravel or of root. They are cuts, narrow, straight, with the clean cross-section left by a worked stone edge, and there are several of them there. Those marks are human. On that much there is no argument at all. Something holding a stone blade was working on this animal, and working very deliberately. Which is the moment when most tellings of this story lean forward and say the obvious, exciting, deeply satisfying thing about all of it. The hunters killed it, the story goes, and a party of early Americans brought down a giant beside the edge of the water. And that is exactly where this story stops and reads the original published paper out loud instead of the headline written about it. Picture it carefully and with all the honesty that the word picture demands. A warm afternoon, somewhere around 14,000 years ago. A pond in a stone bowl, cypress at the edge, the smell of water and mud, and something large that has stopped breathing. A mastodon lies at the waterline. Whether it died there of age, or of sickness, or of a wound, nobody today can say. People come down to it. Perhaps a handful of them, perhaps a whole family group, and they are carrying stone tools with them. A hand takes hold of the tusk. The blade goes in beside it, working the heavy ivory slowly loose from the skull bone. And the marks are made in a few minutes of patient work and then left alone for the next 14,000 years. That is a scene, not a record. The word perhaps is doing a very great deal of work in every line of it. What the stone actually proves is a great deal narrower than the scene, and the narrow version is the one that matters here. The published description does not say hunt anywhere in it. It does not say kill. It says the animal was butchered or scavenged. Butchered or scavenged. Both words in one single sentence, offered as equal possibilities by the very people who brought that tusk up out of the water. Because a cut mark records a blade meeting an animal. It does not record how that animal came to be lying there at all. A group that kills a mastodon leaves cut marks behind. A group that finds one already dead leaves exactly the same marks behind. The stone cannot tell them apart. And the authors went further still, in a single line that almost nobody ever repeats about the marks on the tusk itself. They wrote that the cuts were most likely produced during the extraction of that tusk from its socket in the dead animal's skull. Removing ivory, not carving meat. Which is still a human act, still deliberate, still a person holding a tool and doing skilled work beside the body of a dead animal. Ivory is a valuable material. It is dense, workable, and it makes points and tools that bone and antler simply cannot ever match. So the picture that actually survives the evidence is a person taking a tusk and not a hunting party bringing down a giant. The second picture might well still be true. It is simply not what this animal, in this layer, is able to demonstrate at all. The difference between those two sentences is the entire difference between doing archaeology and telling a good story with a great deal of confidence. Because this is a trap that American archaeology has walked into before, and this channel has walked the entire length of it. It has a name. Equifinality. When two completely different histories end up leaving behind exactly the same physical trace in the ground below. The classic case is Clovis itself, and decades of hard certainty that Clovis people were mammoth hunters above absolutely everything else they did. The evidence for it was largely stone points lying near mammoth bones, in the very same ground and at the very same depth. Near a bone is not proof. A point beside a rib can mean a kill. It can equally mean the butchery of an animal that was already long dead. Or a camp beside a carcass, or a river that rolled two entirely unrelated things into the same bend and buried them together. That certainty has been challenged hard in recent years, and the argument over it is still running in the journals of the field today. The lesson travels well, and it applies to a tusk in a Florida sinkhole just as cleanly as it does to a mammoth rib. Proximity is not causation. So the honest sentence about Paige Ladson is this one. People processed a mastodon here, and how that mastodon died is simply not known. That is a good deal less exciting than a hunt. It is also the only version the evidence in that ground can carry. And it costs the story nothing at all, because the real shock of this place was never the knife in the first place. The knife is the small problem. The large problem is geography, and it does not care in the slightest what actually happened to the mastodon at that muddy waterline. Whatever those people were doing beside that pond, the very first thing they had to do was arrive in Florida at all. And that, with the ice sheets put back onto the map where they properly belong, turns out to be very close to impossible. Close to impossible, but not quite, and the narrow gap between those two words is where this entire story finally comes to live. That is the final chapter of this story, and it is worth the wait, because it is the part that moves the argument. First, though, there is the question of why nobody believed this river for 20 years, and what that says about science itself. Because the reaction to Paige Ladson is a story in itself, and it is usually told badly, in one of two quite wrong ways. Either as a heroic breakthrough against a crowd of fools, or as proof that the establishment hides whatever it finds inconvenient to it. For most of the 20th century, American archaeology had one rule, and that rule was clean, testable, and enormously successful in practice. The first people into the Americas were the makers of Clovis points. They came down through the north, and nothing older existed anywhere. It was called Clovis first, and it was not stupid. It matched all the evidence that actually existed when it was proposed. Clovis points turn up from coast to coast, inside the very same narrow window of time, and they are unmistakable when found. Every claim of something older was tested hard against that rule, and for decades, one after another, all of those claims failed. Sites collapsed on contaminated samples, on mixed layers, on stones that turned out to have been shaped by rivers and not by hands. The rule kept being right year after year, and a rule that keeps on being right is very hard indeed to argue with. So the bar for anything older than Clovis climbed higher and higher, until it stood somewhere up near the roof of the profession. And that is where it gets uncomfortable, because a very high bar and a closed door look absolutely identical from underneath them. Careers were damaged, papers were rejected. People who dug older layers learned to describe them quietly, or not to describe them at all. The resistance was real. It is the reason a black Florida river could hold a well-dated answer for 2 whole decades while the field looked away. And it is the reason so many people tell this story as a cover-up, with Archaeology cast as a villain guarding its secrets. That version is wrong. Not because the resistance did not happen, but because of what happened afterwards, which the cover-up version of the story always leaves out. Paige Ladson was tested, retested, published, argued over, and then finally accepted. It sits in the literature today as a perfectly solid site. Nobody buried it. Nobody lost the samples. The field demanded an extraordinary standard of proof, and this site went and met it. The system worked, slowly. And the difference between slow and corrupt is the difference between a discipline that can be corrected and one that simply cannot. Compare it with a claim that the field genuinely rejected, and the contrast is sharp enough to settle the question by itself. One California site claims people were here about 130,000 years ago, and most of the field has rejected it. Same discipline, same journals. One claim cleared the bar, and the other did not, and the reason was the quality of the evidence. That is not a conspiracy. That is a filter. A filter that lets nothing through at all is broken, but so is a filter that lets everything through. This channel is built on exactly that distinction, and one tap on subscribe is what keeps long investigations like this one being made. Because the argument about this river was never whether it is real. It is real. The argument is about how they got here, which raises the other question people always ask about this site, usually within the first minute of hearing about it at all. Who were they? The answer is not mysterious, and it is not exotic, though an enormous amount of nonsense has been written about it anyway. They were Native Americans, ancestors of the peoples living right across this continent when Europeans arrived, and of the peoples here now. Not a lost race. Not giants, and not refugees from a sunken continent, and not a vanished civilization quietly erased from the record by a museum. And not a crossing from Ice Age Europe, an idea that resurfaces every single time an early American date reaches the evening news. The evidence points where it has always pointed, to ancestors who came out of Northeast Asia, and to descendants who never left here, which is a statement about deep ancestry and nothing more. It does not hand this sinkhole to any one particular modern nation. 14,000 years is a very long time indeed, and peoples move, merge, separate, and change their names across a span like that. So the honest phrasing stays broad. These were the ancestors of Native Americans on their own land, doing skilled and difficult work. Their land, their ancestors, their history, and it ran for many thousands of years before anyone ever arrived to write it down. And the story of how their ancestors first arrived here is the single largest open question in the archaeology of this continent. Which is the payoff worth stopping on because it reverses the usual shape of a discovery story almost completely from end to end. Normally, a find answers something. This one takes an answer that felt entirely settled and quietly removes it from the board altogether. The date is solid, the site is accepted, and the route that everyone was taught in school does not survive either of them. The map is the casualty. And to see quite how badly it fails, the continent has to be redrawn the way it actually looked at the time itself. Two enormous ice sheets covered the north. One sat over the western mountains, the other lay across the whole center and east. Together they sealed the continent shut from one ocean to the other, and they held that seal for many thousands of years. The textbook road runs between them, a corridor that opened up as the two ice sheets pulled apart, letting people walk south. That corridor is the whole story of how the first Americans are supposed to have arrived, and it is drawn almost everywhere. It is in every schoolbook diagram, a neat arrow threading down the middle of the continent toward everything that lies below it. So the real question is when that door actually opened, and whether it was open while somebody was cutting ivory in Florida. That was answered by work on the sediments and on the ancient plant material taken along the corridor route itself, far further north. The two ice sheets physically separated about 13,000 years ago. Before that date, there was simply no gap to walk through. 13,000 years ago. And physical separation is not at all the same thing as a road. A corridor of bare rock, meltwater and mud feeds nobody. To cross it, people needed plants and animals, and something to eat across a journey of many hundreds of very empty miles. The evidence for that ecology, for steppe grass and bison and hare along the route, appears about 12,600 years ago. Later still, by centuries, than the moment when the ice itself pulled back and left a gap between the two great sheets. Now set those dates beside the tusk in the black water of the Oscilla, and hold both of them in view at once. People were sitting beside a Florida sinkhole 14,550 years ago, working ivory with a sharpened stone edge. The corridor did not yet exist, and it would not be livable for something close to 2,000 years after that date. The door was still shut, which means the people at that pond did not come the way the textbook says. They could not have. The ice was there. They came another way. And that is the question this river is really asking, underneath the mastodon and the marks and all 71 of the dates. Not whether people were here early. They were. The question is, what route existed at a time when the famous one did not? The paper that dated this site does not answer that question. It never claims to. It dates a layer and then it stops. Which is the honest thing to do, and it is the reason this site has held up while far louder claims have collapsed. The most discussed possibility is the coast, a route down the Pacific edge by boat, along shorelines that are now deeply drowned. This channel has stood at the other end of that same idea, on a California island that was only ever reachable by water. But a possibility is not a proof, and the Ice Age coastline where that evidence would sit is now far offshore and deep. The archive that would settle it lies underwater, out on a shelf that was open dry land throughout the whole Ice Age. Which is a strange thing to have to say while standing over a river sinkhole that survived precisely because it was drowned. The same water that hid Page Ladson for 14,000 years is very likely hiding the answer to how its people first arrived. And Florida, of all places on Earth, is where that lesson keeps being taught, one blind handful of sediment at a time. There is one more thing in the layers of that sinkhole, and it is easy to lose underneath all the argument about dates. The people who worked that mastodon were not simply passing through. They and the mastodons shared this coastal plain for a long time. The overlap runs to roughly 2,000 years before the very last of the great animals disappeared from this continent entirely. 2,000 years together. That is 100 generations of people living alongside mastodons, hunting them or not hunting them, and leaving almost no trace of it. And here the temptation is enormous, because there is a very famous story waiting to be attached to an overlap like that. The story says people arrived, hunted the great animals down to nothing, and emptied out a continent within a few thousand years. This site does not test that story. It cannot. It has no way at all of measuring what killed the animals of a continent. It records an overlap and nothing else. It shows no cause, no rate, and not one single hunted animal in the sequence. 2,000 years of coexistence could support an argument for hunting pressure. It could just as easily be read directly against it. The end of the mastodons came about 12,600 years ago, and the reasons for it are still being contested. Climate, vegetation, people, disease, and the sheer speed of a rapidly warming world are all still on the table, together, at once. The tusk does not vote. It records only that a person and an animal met once beside a quiet pond that does not exist anywhere anymore. And that is where this story ends, in the same black water where it began, with the light dying an arm's length away. The sinkhole is still down there beneath the oscilla, still black, still holding layers that nobody has yet managed to reach at all. The tusk is out of the water now, and the marks along it are as clear as the day the blade made them. What they actually prove is modest. A person, a stone edge, and one animal, 14,550 years ago. What they cost is a road on a map, drawn confidently for generations, that cannot have carried anybody at all to that pond. The map owes an explanation. Somewhere out on the drowned edge of this continent, under the same kind of dark water, that explanation is very probably still sitting. The tusk waited 14,000 years to be found down there. Whatever came before, it has not been found at all yet.